The following documentary is created by Ian Glassman and Peter Scully.
Throughout the early to mid-1800s, slavery was widespread throughout the United States. While many households owned slaves, others strongly opposed the thought of subjugating another human being. In fact, some were vehement and passionate enough to stand up against the bigotry and rebel against the practice. Those people were part of what is now known as the Abolitionist movement. At the time of its inception, the probability of eradicating slavery was slim. So then, what exactly did the Abolitionist movement hope to achieve? Additionally, who were the audacious leaders of the movement?
Before the Revolution, the only real anti-slavery people were Quakers. Following the Revolution, however, the movement began to gain more support, as demonstrated by the Northwest Ordinance in 1787, which banned slavery in the Northwest Territory. Despite this, at the time, there were no real groups dedicated to abolishing slavery, and abolitionists remained very unpopular until around the 1830s. In the 1820s, the Second Great Awakening, a massive religious revival, spawned various reform movements, including the abolitionist and women's rights movements. One of the people to emerge as an abolitionist was Theodore Dwight Weld, who would go on in 1839 to write American Slavery as It Is, Testimony of 1,000 Witnesses. This would become a handbook for the abolitionists for over a decade.
Early on, the abolitionists faced many challenges. They were determined to start making progress, but pleasing both the North and the South wasn't very easy, as both sides had differing views on the issue of slavery. Not to mention, at the time, abolition was considered unconstitutional. Therefore, the movement started focusing on the North, where citizens generally disapproved of slavery. They looked for ways to abolish slavery. One of the most popular plans at first was to colonize Liberia as a refuge for escaped slaves. The American Colonization Society, or the ACS, began settling former slaves and freeborn blacks there in the 1820s. By the 1830s, however, this group had lost most of its support. Despite the fall of the ACS, more abolitionist activism emerged when William Lloyd Garrison, one of the most famous abolitionists, published his first issue of The Liberator on January 1st, 1831. The passage called for an immediate prohibition of slavery. At the time, this stance was viewed as one of the most radical, and because of this, the spirit never caught on, and no direct progress was made. Still, the publication of The Liberator spread influence and notoriety, as Garrison persevered and continued to fight slavery. One way he did this was by establishing the New England Anti-Slavery Society, and in 1833, the American Anti-Slavery Society, with Arthur and Lewis Tappan. Also in 1833, the British officially outlawed slavery, which helped the movement gain support and recognition. In 1835, the group released a tremendous amount of propaganda, even going as far as to send abolitionist literature to the slave states. All of this helped the movement gain support, but by the beginning of 1840, the growth had caused the abolitionists to split into two groups: radical abolitionists, or Garrisonians, and political abolitionists.
Garrisonians were, as implied by the name, led by Garrison, and in addition to believing that slavery should be abolished, they also believed in most reform movements of the day, including the women's rights and temperance movements. Additionally, they believed that everything was corrupt, including the government, and went as far as refusing to vote or hold office. Garrison even burned a copy of the Constitution. The group would eventually collapse because of arguments on two issues: whether or not women should have equal participation and whether or not abolitionists should be able to run as independents for public office despite the supposed corruption. The political abolitionists, on the other hand, were led by Arthur and Lewis Tappan, Gerrit Smith, and former slaveholder James G. Birney. In 1840, they formed the Liberty Party, which believed in banning slave trade in Washington, D.C., the removal of black codes or prejudice laws against free blacks, banning slave trade involving multiple states, and ending the admission of slave states into the Union. They nominated Birney for president, but he only received a mere 7,000 votes because the party's views were too radical. Despite the loss, the party persisted, and in 1844 Birney ran again, this time gaining 61,000 votes in helping James K. Polk win the election. By 1848, the Liberty Party had disintegrated, however, but in their place was the less radical Free Soil Party. The Free Soil Party had formed due to the admission of Texas into the Union as a slave state in 1845 and the acquisition of Mexican territory in 1846. They believed only in banning of slave trade in Washington, D.C., and in no longer admitting slave states into the Union, so they got more support and were even able to get several candidates into Congress. Their presidential candidate in 1848 was former President Martin Van Buren, who gained over 290,000 votes, or about 10% of the popular vote, but no electoral votes. By 1852, the party had lost support, and their candidate John P. Hale got below 160,000 votes.
Men were not the only abolitionists, however. There were many female abolitionists too, but they mainly were in female-only abolitionist groups. Two prime examples of female abolitionists are Sarah and Angelina Grimke, who left their slave-owning family to go to the North. There, they converted to Quakerism and became abolitionists and women's rights activists. They began to speak publicly against slavery, first to women-only crowds, and then to people of both genders. Angelina would marry Theodore Weld. Later on, towards the 1840s and 1850s, the abolitionist movement progressed. The country as a whole began to question whether slavery should be permitted or prohibited in the country's newly added western territories. In the year 1850, however, the Fugitive Slave Law was passed, which required people to seize and return runaway slaves. Many abolitionists were outraged, including one author by the name of Harriet Beecher Stowe.
Harriet Beecher Stowe, born on June 14, 1811, in Litchfield, Connecticut, contributed to the start of the American Civil War and the abolitionist movement by writing her fabled novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin. Stowe attended the Hartford Female Seminary as a student before growing up to teach there. In 1832, the Stowes moved out to Cincinnati, Ohio, where slave territory lay just across the Ohio River. During their residency in Ohio, Stowe interviewed several former slaves who had escaped along the Underground Railroad, a secret pathway that slaves used to escape to the north. Many of the characters from Uncle Tom's Cabin exemplified real-life individuals such as Hosea Henson, a fugitive slave who escaped from Kentucky to Canada along the Underground Railroad with his wife and his 2 kids. Stowe visited plantations frequently, making her resent slavery even more. 4 years later, Stowe married Calvin Ellis Stowe, a seminary professor. From there, they moved to Brunswick, Maine, after Calvin accepted a position at Bowdoin College.
At their home in Maine, Beecher was asked in a special request by her sister-in-law, quote, to write something that would make this whole nation feel what an accursed thing slavery is. Fueled by her sister-in-law's words and the injustice of the Fugitive Slave Act, she wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was published in 1852. The book highlights both some kind and patriarchal aspects of slavery and the dark, cruel side by including vivid descriptions of the suffering and oppression slaves faced on a daily basis.
Nevertheless, the publication of Uncle Tom's Cabin was an unprecedented success in American publishing. Approximately 3 million copies were sold prior to the American Civil War, and it has been, as of today, translated into 55 languages. It has been presented numerous times on stage and in motion pictures as well. Because of Stowe's dedicated and far-reaching work, she even had a conference with Abraham Lincoln. When Lincoln met her, he exaggerated her success by saying, quote, "So you're the little woman who wrote the book that made this big war."
Following the success of her publication, Stowe moved back to Hartford, Connecticut, nearby her birthplace, where she continued to write books, though she only wrote one more on slavery. There, she passed away on July 1st, 1896. Still, her legacy continues to inspire millions of people across the country.
Her home in Hartford, Connecticut is now part of a museum where you can take a tour.
Along with Harriet Beecher Stowe, many other powerful abolitionists emerged in the 1800s, including a former slave named Frederick Douglass. After fleeing enslavement, Douglass retained the horrific memories of slavery and wanted to make a difference. He began to lecture people across the country about the subject of freedom. Over time, Douglass earned himself a reputation by the people. However, some people doubted that he was actually a slave because of his eloquence. Additionally, he still frequently faced bigotry and intolerance towards African Americans. One time when Douglass took a train to speak in a southern city, he was demanded to sit in the section reserved for colored people at the end of the train. When the hosts met Douglass at the end of the train ride, they apologized that he had been humiliated and told to sit in the back of the train. Douglass responded by saying, quote, "Gentlemen, by ignoble actions I may degrade myself, but nothing and no man can degrade Frederick Douglass."
In 1845, he wrote his autobiography, which detailed the horrors of slavery and had a large impact on society.
In 1847, he started publishing a newspaper in Rochester, New York, called the North Star. The newspaper title refers to the star that slaves would follow at night in order to travel northwards and escape to freedom.
According to Douglass, his main goals were to, quote, abolish slavery in all its forms and aspects, promote the moral and intellectual improvement of the colored people, and hasten the day of freedom to the 3 millions of our enslaved fellow countrymen. Although Douglass is known for his ability to deliver a message effectively and inspire a crowd, he wasn't always self-assured in front of an audience.
In his first public speech in 1841, Douglass was asked to speak about his experience as a slave. At first, Douglass was shy and too nervous to open up about his past. However, as he went on, he became more confident in himself and his speaking skills. After that, Douglass traveled all around to speak out against slavery. Throughout his mission, Douglass was associated with many other abolitionists, such as Wendell Phillips, William Lloyd Garrison, and Owen Lovejoy. Along with African American rights, Douglass also fought for women's rights, alongside Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, Sojourner Truth, Susan B. Anthony, and many more.
In 1860, President Abraham Lincoln was sworn into office as President of the United States. Although he did not consider himself an abolitionist, he opposed the spread of slavery in the newly acquired Western territories. Southerners felt threatened by Lincoln's election over the issue of slavery. After many conflicts, the Southern states seceded from the Union, and the Civil War broke out. Many abolitionists brought on the war to reach a turning point, which is exactly what happened. The war ultimately led Lincoln to issue the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, which freed slaves in the area of the rebellion. After the war ended, slavery was abolished across the entire country under the 13th Amendment of the United States Constitution.
In conclusion, the abolitionist movement consisted of many people of both genders and both whites and African Americans. They wanted to abolish slavery, but had differing views on how to do it. Some wanted to use political power, while others preferred lectures and books. Many supported other reform movements as well, such as the women's rights movement. In the end, though, they all wanted one thing: justice and liberty for African Americans.